It was a Sunday, one of those quiet, padded ones where the world feels like it's wrapped in a wool blanket. The sky outside was dull and pale, and the toast had gone slightly cold on my plate. We weren't really talking, just sort of breathing, in the same room. Then Mom reached into her bag and slid something across the table toward me. It was wrapped, neatly, too neatly, with tissue paper and a ribbon that didn't suit the kitchen. She said, too casually, "We saw this and thought of you." That's when I knew. Not because I'm psychic, but because I've lived in that house long enough to read the real messages. I peeled back the paper slowly, already bracing. And there it was. How to grow up. 100 practical steps to take before it's too late. A hardback. Shiny cover. Embossed letters like it was proud of itself. I didn't say anything for a moment. The room tilted slightly. My dad cleared his throat and reached for the marmalade. Mom was watching me with that hopeful smile she uses when she's asking if I've heard back from any jobs yet. I ran my fingers over the title and tried to laugh. Bit on the nose, isn't it? But my voice came out thinner than I meant. "Oh, it's just full of practical advice," she said, taking a sip of tea like we weren't suddenly standing on opposite cliffs. "Things like how to budget, how to set goals, how to move out. It's actually very helpful." I nodded, said thanks. I always say thanks, even when I don't mean it, especially when I don't mean it. They didn't mean to hurt me. That's what I kept telling myself later. But they also didn't ask if I wanted their help. They'd looked at me and decided something was wrong, that I was stuck, wasting time, failing. The worst part is, they weren't entirely wrong. Back in my room, I set the book on my nightstand and stared at it like it might blink first. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of trying to explain that I wasn't lost. I just didn't have a map that looked like theirs. I didn't open it that night. I just lay there, feeling the quiet press in around me, like the house itself was disappointed. I wanted to be anywhere else. I didn't tell anyone about the book. It sat on my nightstand like a dare. Every time I reached for my phone, or a cup of tea, or just glanced that way, it was there, glaring without eyes, judging without a voice. The longer I ignored it, the louder it felt. But I still didn't touch it, not for a week. Instead, I drifted. Watched too much telly with the sound low, opened job sites only to close them minutes later. Tried to write a cover letter and ended up Googling how to sound like you know what you're doing. I walked, past mirrors quickly, avoided eye contact with my own reflection. It's not like I was doing nothing. I showered, I ate, I even helped Mom load the dishwasher. But it wasn't enough, not the kind of enough they wanted, and somehow, even doing the small things made it worse, like pretending to be functional only highlighted the gaps. On Thursday, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to listen, but I'd gone downstairs for water and froze in the hallway when I heard my name. "She's drifting," Mom said quietly. "We can't just keep waiting for her to get it. Together." "She's 22, Dad replied. "Maybe she just needs time." There was a pause. And what if time isn't enough? I tiptoed back up the stairs, glass still empty. That sentence followed me all the way back to bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering what enough looked like. A flat of my own, a full-time job, a mortgage, and a reliable set of mugs. That night, I finally opened the book. Page 1. Adulthood isn't a moment. It's a series of decisions you make when no one else is watching. I laughed, but not because it was funny, more like the laugh you give when you trip in public. And pretend it didn't hurt. The next few pages were full of lists. Lists about budgeting, self-discipline, networking, laundry, taxes, job interviews. I hated how sensible it all sounded. How familiar. Like a version of the voice in my head, just tidier. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a guide. It was a blueprint. One they wanted me to follow, step by step, like a child putting together flat-pack furniture. Neat, predictable, measured, except I'd never fit in their neat little diagrams. Not really. I was always the weird piece left over. I closed the book halfway through chapter 1, not because I was bored, because it was starting to make too much sense, and I Wasn't sure if that scared me more or less. I didn't sleep that night. The words from that book, it was like they burrowed in. Not just the sentences, but the tone. Calm, instructional, unwavering. It had this eerie confidence, like whoever wrote it had never once doubted their life. Choices. As if adulthood was a club you could enter if you just followed the checklist. I wanted to be angry at it. Instead, I just felt itchy, restless, like something inside me was being rearranged, and I didn't get a say. The next morning, I put on jeans. Real ones, not joggers. I brushed my hair properly and even put on mascara. Not for anyone, not for a job interview, not for a selfie, just because I needed to feel awake, solid, like a person. Mom noticed at breakfast. Her eyes flicked to my face, then down to my clothes. "You're up early," she said. "Neutral. Careful." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, stirring cereal that had long gone soggy. "Had things on my mind." Neither of us said what kind of things. She cleared her throat. "Your dad and I were thinking, if you wanted, we could help you look at some courses or temp agencies." I nodded, too quickly. It wasn't a lie exactly. I had been thinking about all of that. But something had shifted, and I didn't know how to explain it, not even to myself. I didn't want to talk about courses or jobs or interviews. I wanted to talk about the why everything felt like walking through glue, why opening that book had left me breathless. Instead, I said, "Sure, that could be useful." Later, that day, I finished the book. All of it, in one sitting. My tea went cold, my legs fell asleep, I didn't move until the last page. There was nothing dramatic about the ending. No great insight, no revelation, just a quiet summary. Growth is a choice you make every day. It is not linear, it is not glamorous, but it is yours. I closed the book with trembling hands, because I knew in that exact moment I couldn't stay. Not here, not like this, not as someone trying to prove I was making progress just to keep people calm. It wasn't that I didn't love them. I did. But love wasn't fixing the part of me that felt frozen. And reading that book, reading their message, I realized something they hadn't. They thought I was lost. But really, I was trapped. And the scariest part? I had no idea what I was about to do, just that I needed to go, to disappear, to figure it out somewhere else. And so, quietly, without drama or shouting or tears, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to leave. I didn't pack much. A backpack, mostly, jeans, jumpers, underwear, my old journal, and a half-dead pen. Headphones, the charger I always lost track of. I stared at the spine of that book, How to Grow Up, for a long time before finally sliding it in two. It felt important to take it, like proof, like something I might need to look at later, when all of this started to feel like a mistake. Leaving wasn't dramatic. It wasn't storming out or slamming doors. It was quiet. Cowardly, maybe. But I couldn't face them. Not with what I was about to do. I wrote a note. 2 lines, scribbled in the half-dark while the house was still asleep. "I'm okay. I just need time. Please don't look for me. Love, M." I left it on the kitchen table, right next to the cereal box. By the time the sun had properly risen, I was already on the train, heading out of the city through foggy fields and sleepy towns that didn't know my name. I picked a destination at random the night before, something far enough that it wouldn't be easy to come back on a whim. Somewhere anonymous, somewhere clean. It hit me then, how utterly stupid this might be. I had no plan, no job, barely. Enough money to last 2 weeks. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but it wasn't just fear. It was adrenaline. A weird sort of freedom that made my heart pound like I was running. Maybe I was. I watched the blur of countryside through the train window and tried to imagine the moment they'd find the note. Mum, half awake, holding her cup of tea in that mug with the chipped handle. Dad pacing, running his hands through his thinning hair. They'd think it was a tantrum. Maybe they'd even laugh a little at first. "She'll be back by dinner." But dinner would come and go. and I wouldn't be back. The guilt didn't sink in until we pulled into the station, some tiny place that smelled like rain and cold metal. I stood on the platform with my breath puffing in clouds, realizing I was now officially alone. No welcome committee, no plan, just me and a postcode I'd scribbled onto the notes app at 2 a.m. I found a hostel nearby. Cheap, slightly damp walls. Thin as paper. I paid in cash and didn't give my full name. That first night was the loneliest of my life, but I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't scared. I was terrified. But for the first time in months, the fear felt alive, not heavy. It wasn't the kind that sinks into your bones. It was the kind that buzzes under your skin and tells you, something's about to happen. And I didn't know what that something was. But I was ready to find out. It's funny, really, how much you can get done when no one knows where you are. How you can suddenly become a person you don't recognize when there's no one to remind you who you were before. I woke up early. The next day, the hostel room still pitch dark, but I didn't sleep well. I spent the night tossing, a restless thought looping through my mind. What now? I had no idea what now was. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went out. I left the hostel with nothing but a crumpled map in my pocket and my phone switched off so no one could track me. It felt strangely liberating, walking through streets I didn't recognize, not knowing what would happen next. No schedules, no expectations. Just me, a bit lost, a bit found. The city felt distant, like it wasn't real, like I had stepped into a parallel world, one where I could erase everything from before. It felt like a movie, one where I had the main role, and for once, I wasn't a supporting character in someone else's story. I spent the next few days figuring out the basics, where the grocery store was, which coffee shop had the best flat whites, how to avoid the groups of tourists, and keep my head down. In a place like this, no one expects to see the same face twice. No one asks your name, not really. And I liked that. I liked how simple it all was. If I didn't want to be seen, I could disappear in plain sight. After a few days of this, I found a job. Well, found might be a bit of a stretch. It was more like I stumbled across it. A cafe tucked into the corner of a side street, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I walked in, saw a notice for a barista position, and asked if they were still hiring. The manager, Emma, which I thought was funny, looked at me, sized me up for a moment, then gave me an apron and told me to start that afternoon. I didn't know the first thing about making coffee, but I figured it out. My hands worked without me thinking too much, pulling shots, steaming milk, serving coffee like it was my calling. I think she could tell I was just trying to blend in, not make a scene. There was something about me, something off, and I think she understood that too. By the end of the week, I'd stopped feeling like a stranger in the city. The buzz of the cafe, the hum of the espresso machine, the chatter of regulars who didn't know my name but smiled at me anyway, it all started to feel familiar. I hadn't thought about the book much in those first days. But, of course, that's when it crept in, when I least expected it. One night, as I cleaned up at the end of my shift, the question popped into my head. What did that book mean? It wasn't just a gift. It was a push. It was a shove. And in that moment, I knew my parents hadn't been wrong to give it to me. They were just ahead of the curve. They saw something in me before I could see it myself. But I wasn't sure I was ready to confront it yet. The city was becoming my refuge. I was finally doing what I'd been too afraid to do at home. Facing the unknown. Facing myself. And every day, every shift at the cafe, I got a little bit closer to answering the questions I'd been running from. I don't know when I started feeling like I was becoming someone else, but it hit me one morning as I poured over a cup of coffee that I'd made myself. No one had ever taught me to make coffee. Yet, here I was, in a foreign city, making perfect lattes and feeling strangely accomplished. I wasn't sure how it happened, but something had clicked inside of me. I was no longer the girl who'd fled home, uncertain and confused. The girl who felt suffocated by expectations, trapped in the corridors of a life she never chose. I was finding my rhythm, and with it came a strange sense of peace. At the cafe, Emma had become something of a mentor to me. She was sharp, direct, but always had a little smirk on her face when I asked questions. "Don't overthink it," she'd tell me when I made a mistake. "Just let it flow." And she didn't just mean the coffee, she meant life. It felt easier to breathe here. There were no expectations hanging over me, no invisible strings pulling me in every direction. When I walked out of the cafe, it was into a world of possibilities. And no one knew my past. No one expected anything from me other than to show up and do my job. It was simple, clean, and for the first time in months, I wasn't feeling the weight of my parents' expectations on my shoulders. But that doesn't mean it was all perfect. Sometimes when I closed my eyes at night, I'd hear the sound of my mother's voice asking me why I'd done it, asking what I was really running from. And for a long time, I didn't have an answer. I remember one night, just after I'd finished my shift, stepping outside into the cool air, and there it was again. The thought. The thing I'd been pushing aside. My parents. What would they think if they knew I was here, living like this? Would they still believe that I was lost? Or would they finally see that I was trying to find my way, even if I hadn't yet found all the pieces? I stared up at the city skyline, trying to make sense of everything. The city lights twinkled like they held a secret I wasn't privy to. Everything felt so far away. My old life, my family, even the book they gave me. It felt distant, like it was part of someone else's story now. But the thing about running is, no matter how far you go, a part of you always stays behind. I couldn't help but wonder if I was really as far gone as I liked to think I was. Or if, deep down, I was just trying to outrun something that would always find me. I didn't want to think about that. Not yet. So I just kept walking. I kept moving deeper into the city, into the rhythm of the life I was building, and with every step, the answer seemed to slip further away, like the horizon I kept chasing, always just out of reach. At the cafe the next morning, I found myself serving a regular who'd started coming in more often lately. His name was James, and he'd struck up a few casual conversations with me over the last week. He was a writer, he said. He came to the cafe to work, to be distracted enough to focus. One morning, as I handed him his coffee, he stopped me with a question that caught me off guard. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked, looking at me with an almost intense curiosity. I almost laughed. What's next? I hadn't thought about it in ages. I had just been living, existing, surviving the day. "I'm not sure yet," I said, a bit too quickly, "but I think I'm finally figuring it out." James smiled like he could see through my answer, but he didn't. Push. Instead, he left me with a strange sense of unease. The question still hung in the air. What was next? Was I really figuring it out, or was I just running from it all? It didn't matter, I told myself. Not yet. I closed the door of the cafe. That night, the weight of the question following me like a shadow, but I didn't have to answer it. Not yet. I'd always thought that when you leave everything behind, you could start fresh. I thought if I removed myself from the people who knew my story, the weight of their expectations, I could reinvent myself completely. But somewhere between the cafe and the late-night walks through the city streets, I began to realize something. No matter how far I went, my past had a way of catching up with me. It wasn't the obvious things. It wasn't the phone calls or the messages from my parents, though they kept coming, silent reminders of the guilt that had been building ever since I left. It was the smaller things, like how I caught myself humming the same song my mother always played when she cleaned the house, or how the smell of a particular brand of soap at a corner store would stop me dead in my tracks, taking me back to lazy Sunday mornings at home when I used to sit on the floor and sketch while my parents argued about something inconsequential. I tried to push those thoughts away, but no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many hours I spent perfecting lattes and chatting with customers, it was like the ghosts of my past were always lingering just around the corner, waiting to whisper in my ear. It was one of those late-night shifts when I saw him again. James had been coming in regularly for the last few days, his nose buried in his laptop, scribbling notes in the margins of his pages. We'd exchanged small talk before, but that night, as the cafe was closing, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I hesitated. I didn't know much about him, just that he was a writer who'd left the city for something quieter, trying to get his next novel started. He'd been here long enough that I'd begun to feel like I knew him in some small way. But something about the invitation felt too personal, too sudden. But I agreed anyway. Maybe I was craving the company, or maybe it was the need for distraction. Either way, I found myself walking with him through the dimly lit streets toward a nearby pub, the kind with a low ceiling and old wooden floors that creaked when you walked. We didn't talk much at first, just exchanged the usual pleasantries. But after a couple of drinks, the conversation turned toward writing, and then, inevitably, toward life. "So," James said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "What's your story? You never talk about it." He froze. It was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks, the one I knew would come sooner or later. I tried to laugh it off, deflecting. "Not much to tell, really. Just here for a change." James raised an eyebrow. "That's it? You just woke up one day and decided to leave everything behind?" I nodded, but the weight of the answer settled heavily in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or myself. It wasn't just that I left everything behind. It was that I was running. From what? I wasn't sure, but I could feel the ache of it in every corner of my life. James didn't push, and the conversation drifted elsewhere. But as the night wore on, I found myself becoming more comfortable with him, sharing little details about the move, about the job, about how life had felt like an endless loop I couldn't break out of. It wasn't a confession exactly, but it felt close. And I realized, in that moment, that I hadn't been entirely honest with anyone. Not even myself. The night ended with a quiet walk back to the cafe, where I found myself standing outside for a moment, trying to digest everything I just said. That was when I saw it. A familiar number flashing on my phone. My mother's name. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The last time I'd spoken to her, she'd begged me to come back. She'd asked me why I was doing this to the family, why I was turning my back on everything I'd ever known. I hadn't answered, and I wasn't sure I was ready to answer now. Naru let it ring out, letting the silence of the night take over once more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The distance I had put between us might have been physical, but it wasn't enough to keep her out of my thoughts, and it wouldn't be enough to keep her away forever. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the weight of the moment settling heavily on my shoulders. The echoes of the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you ran. The city had a way of changing everything. The unfamiliar streets, the sounds of late-night traffic, the smell of street food drifting in the air, it was all a kind of symphony, chaotic yet strangely comforting. But amidst all the newness, something had shifted inside me, and I wasn't sure if it was the city doing the changing, or if it was just me. I'd thought that leaving would give me a clean slate, a chance to rewrite my story, but the more time I spent away from home, the more I started to feel the pull of that other life, the one I'd tried to escape. It was like the city was a mirror, reflecting back all the things I was trying to outrun. I didn't want to face it. But I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call from my mother the night before. It had been brief, the tension in her voice unmistakable. "I just want to know you're okay," she'd said, her words edged with something I couldn't quite place. "Please don't shut us out." And yet, that's exactly what I'd been doing, shutting them out, shutting everyone out. I'd convinced myself that being alone was the solution, but the longer I stayed away, the more I realized how deeply I'd been fooling myself. James had become a kind of tether to reality, someone I could talk to without feeling like I was carrying the weight of my past with me. His casual, almost nonchalant approach to life was in sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. He didn't ask questions, didn't prod at my past or my reasons for leaving. He just let me exist in this new version of myself, without judgment. We met again a few days after the phone call. This time we found a quieter spot in a local bar, a dark corner away from the crowds. We exchanged a few pleasantries, the kind that still felt a little awkward, but the conversation quickly turned to more personal things. "So, tell me," James said after taking a sip of his drink. "What's your plan here? I mean, really, what are you hoping to find? I wasn't sure how to answer him. The truth was, I didn't know what I was looking for. It wasn't a new job or a new life, because those things hadn't fixed anything. It wasn't freedom either, because that was a lie I had told myself to feel less guilty about leaving. I'm not sure, I admitted, feeling the weight of the words sink in. I thought I was running away from something, but I'm not so sure anymore. Maybe I'm just lost. James didn't respond immediately, instead just watching me with an almost knowing look. It wasn't pity or even concern. It was something else, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Everyone's lost in a way, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. You just have to figure out where you want to go from there. I wanted to ask him more about what he meant, about whether he felt lost too, but I didn't. Instead, I stared down at my drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, and thought about everything that had led me here. It was then that I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't about running away from my past. It wasn't about escaping my parents, or my old life, or even the expectations that had been set before me. This was about me, about figuring out who I was without anyone else's narrative. I was tired of being defined by what others thought of me, tired of letting their ideas of who I should be dictate the choices I made. I didn't need to answer to anyone but myself, but that didn't mean the guilt had faded. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. What if I'd made a mistake? What if the distance between us was irreparable? I pushed those thoughts away, determined not to dwell on them for too long. The night was still young, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the edge of something. Not an answer, not closure, but something new, something undefined. James leaned back in his chair, breaking my train of thought. You know, he said casually, I think you're on the right path. It might not be clear yet, but you're heading in the right direction. It was strange hearing someone else say it, someone who barely knew me, but it made me realize that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as lost as I thought. I wasn't looking for something outside of myself. I was looking for the strength to finally face what had been inside me all along. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the tools to figure it out. The morning after the conversation with James, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. I reached over and groggily grabbed it, squinting at the screen. It was a message from my mother, the text short but sharp. In its urgency, Emma, please call me. It's important. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a twinge of guilt knot in my stomach. I had been avoiding their calls, avoiding them altogether, convinced that space was the answer. But it wasn't just space they needed. It was a connection. And somewhere along the line, I'd severed that thread. I took a deep breath and dialed her number, my heart hammering against my ribs as I listened to the rings. Emma, she answered, quickly, her voice tight, laced with emotion. Where are you? Are you okay? We've been trying to reach you. I could hear her trying to mask her worry, but it was there, unmistakable. I had never been good at hiding my feelings, and in that moment, it was clear that she could hear it in my voice too. I'm fine, I said, my words coming out more hollow than I intended. Just sorting things out. I didn't want to worry you. Emma, she said again, her voice softer now, but still holding an edge. You didn't have to go. You could have talked to us. You didn't have to do this on your own. There it was, the crux of it. They thought I was running away. They thought I was lost, spiraling into something darker than I was willing to admit. But the truth? I wasn't running away from them. I was running towards something. I just didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know how to talk to you, I confessed, feeling the weight of the words, each one heavier than the last. I thought I needed to figure it out on my own. Her silence on the other end was enough to tell me that my words had landed. She didn't understand, not yet, but she was trying. She had to. You're not alone in this, Emma, she said finally. You never were. I closed my eyes, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear that, how badly I needed to hear that I wasn't alone, even when I felt so deeply isolated. "I know," I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time in weeks. I need time. I need to find my own way. But I promise I'll be okay." The conversation ended with a promise to talk again soon, but something had shifted. The walls I'd built around myself, thinking they were for protection, were starting to crack. Maybe it was time to let someone in again. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed, the morning sun filtering through the window, casting light on the city outside. I had always thought that growing up meant leaving everything behind, leaving home, leaving my past, leaving the people who didn't understand me. But I was beginning to realize that growing up wasn't about running. It was about accepting the things you can't control, the things you can't leave behind, and learning how to move forward with them instead of in spite of them. I spent the next few hours reflecting, my mind swirling with thoughts about my parents, about the life I'd left behind, and about the life I was slowly building here. But amidst all the confusion, one thought stood out clearly. There was no formula for this, no guidebook, no step-by-step instructions on how to fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. When I stood up to make breakfast, I realized I hadn't thought about the book in days. It had been lying on my desk, tucked away beneath a stack of papers, and for the first time since I'd left, I felt no need to pick it up. I was learning something far more important. Growing up wasn't about fitting into a mold or following some prescribed set of rules. It was about creating my own path, one day at a time. As I scrambled eggs in the small, makeshift kitchen, I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, gentle but firm. "You're not alone in this, Emma." And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to believe it. It had been weeks since I last spoke to my parents, and despite the growing tension in the back of my mind, the silence felt strangely comfortable. I had begun to carve out a life here, a life that was mine, independent, and free from the expectations I had left behind. But there was a subtle dissonance in the air, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried to push it away. I'd started a new job in a small cafe where the customers came and went like the weather, fleeting and ephemeral. It was the kind of work I had never imagined myself doing, but it was a start. I made coffee, took orders, and pretended I didn't feel the constant weight of failure pressing down on me. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something real. Then, one afternoon, as I wiped down the counter and scanned the empty street outside, the door jingled open. I glanced up and froze. It was James. His face was the last thing I expected to see, and for a moment, I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it was him, stepping into the cafe with that familiar, sheepish smile that I had once found so comforting. He looked around briefly before his eyes landed on me. "Emma?" His voice was hesitant, uncertain. I stood still for a moment, unsure how to react. There was a knot in my stomach, a strange combination of relief and dread. I hadn't spoken to him since the night we talked about my parents, since I made that decision to leave. I had expected him to fade into the background of my life like so many others had, but here he was, standing in front of me as if nothing had changed. "James," I said softly, my throat suddenly tight. "What are you doing here?" I came to check on you," he replied, looking a bit uncomfortable. "I know you've been away, and I wanted to see how you're doing. You've been kind of hard to reach." I bit my lip, my mind racing. I had been avoiding him, had been avoiding everyone in my life, but seeing him here, standing in the cafe like a blast from the past, reminded me of everything I was running from. "I'm fine," I said, the words sounding more like a lie than I intended. "I'm just figuring things out." James didn't seem convinced, but he nodded, taking a seat at the counter. "I figured as much. But Emma, I've been worried. You left without saying anything. No word, no explanation. It's not like you." I stiffened at his words, suddenly defensive. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, I said quickly, my voice harsher than I intended. I needed to do this on my own. His expression softened, and he studied me for a moment, like he was trying to read between the lines. I get it, he said slowly, but you don't have to do this alone. You've always had people who care about you. You don't have to shut everyone out. I felt a wave of frustration surge through me, a sharp ache of vulnerability that I wasn't sure how to deal with. I had been so sure of my decision to leave, so confident that I could make it on my own, but hearing him say those words made me question everything. I don't know how to go back, I whispered, barely above a breath. I don't know how to fix things. I don't know who I am anymore. James leaned forward, his gaze steady and kind. Maybe you don't have to have everything figured out right now. Maybe it's okay to not know, but you don't have to do it alone. The words settled over me like a heavy blanket, warm and comforting, yet suffocating all the same. I didn't know if I was ready for any of this, ready to confront my past, to face the people I'd left behind, to let them in again. But in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. Growing up wasn't about knowing everything or having it all together. It was about learning to ask for help when you needed it, even if it meant admitting that you didn't have all the answers. As James sat there waiting for my response, I felt a sudden weight lift off my chest. I wasn't alone in this. Not really. Not if I didn't want to be. I took a deep breath, my heart racing with 1,000 emotions I couldn't name. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, I was going to have to face what I had left behind, face the people who had always cared, and face the person I had become. And maybe, just maybe, that was the hardest part of growing up. The days that followed James's visit were a blur of conflicting emotions. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. Part of me wanted to crawl back into the life I'd been building here, quiet, simple, untouched by the complexities of my past. But another part of me, the part I had tried to suppress, felt the pull to return to the people I had abandoned. My parents, my friends. I kept replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. James's words echoed in the quiet moments of my day. You don't have to do this alone. But I wasn't sure how to let them back in, how to untangle the mess I'd left behind. The truth was, I wasn't just avoiding my family. I was avoiding the responsibility of growth. What did it even mean to grow up? Was it about proving I could make it on my own? Was it about meeting expectations? Or was it something else entirely? The book, How to Grow Up, hadn't answered those questions for me. If anything, it had left me with more confusion than clarity. I still hadn't spoken to my parents since the day I left. I hadn't answered their calls or read the letters they'd sent. Each one felt like a thread pulling me back to a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. One evening, as I closed the cafe and gathered my things to leave, I noticed a familiar figure standing just outside the door. My breath caught in my chest. Was my mother. She was standing there, looking uncertain, hesitant, as if she weren't sure whether she should come closer. The moment I saw her, a wave of guilt crashed over me. My heart began to race as I slowly approached her, unsure of what to say. What could I say? Mom? I finally managed, my voice small. She smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. I didn't know where else to find you, Emma. I've been trying to reach you. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many questions I needed to ask, but the words felt stuck in my throat. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched. Can we talk? I nodded again, feeling a lump form in my throat. She looked at me carefully, as if waiting for me to invite her in. And I realized, with sudden clarity, that I had been waiting for this moment too. I had been avoiding it, but deep down, I knew this was the moment I had to face. We walked to a nearby bench, sitting down in the soft evening light. There was an uncomfortable silence between us, as if we were both waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, my mother broke the silence. Emma, she said, her voice soft but laden with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry. I know I've pushed you too hard. I just wanted you to be happy. To find your way." I blinked, surprised by her words. "I thought you just wanted me to grow up," I said quietly, my voice betraying the bitterness I had been trying to suppress. My mother's eyes softened and she reached out to touch my hand. "I do want that, sweetheart, but I realize now, I was wrong about how to help you get there. I should have trusted you more. You were always capable of making your own choices. I was scared." I sat back, letting her words sink in. "Scared of what?" "Of losing you," she admitted. "Of you drifting away. Of not knowing who you were becoming. But I see now. Maybe I was more afraid of what I didn't understand than of what you needed." I felt a pang in my chest. This was what I had been avoiding. The fear of losing them, of growing up and becoming someone they couldn't recognize. But it wasn't just about them, it was about me. About who I wanted to be, not who they expected me to be. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to explain that I needed space, time. I needed to find myself." She squeezed my hand, her gaze warm and understanding. "You don't have to apologize. You're allowed to need space. You're allowed to figure it out on your own. I just want you to know that no matter where you go or what you do, we're here. You don't have to face it alone." I let out a shaky breath, a mix of relief and guilt flooding me all at once. The truth was, I didn't have all the answers. I wasn't sure what the future would look like, or if I even had a clear sense of who I was yet. But one thing had become clear. I couldn't keep running away from my past, from my family, from the people who loved me. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could keep pushing them away, keep living this half-life, distant, from the things that mattered most. Or I could take a deep breath, face the mess I had created, and try to rebuild something that was real, something that allowed me to grow without losing myself in the process. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe growing up didn't mean sacrificing everything I had ever known. Maybe it was about learning to embrace who I was, even if I didn't have all the answers yet. My mother sat beside me in silence for a moment before speaking again, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll figure it out, Emma. Together." And just like that, for the first time in a long while, I believed her. Returning home felt wrong, as though I no longer belonged in the place that had once been everything to me. The thought of facing my parents after everything was unsettling, yet here I was, standing outside their door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. The familiar hum of the television echoed through the walls, a reminder of the ordinary life that had continued without me. Had they even noticed I was gone? Or had they simply moved on, assuming I wouldn't come back? The door opened, and there stood my father, looking at me for a moment before recognition hit him. His expression softened, though it didn't completely hide his surprise. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet. "You're home." I nodded, unsure how to respond, unsure if I was ready for this, but there was no turning back now. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice barely audible. My father stepped aside without a word, a gesture that felt more welcoming than I expected. Of course. Inside, the house was exactly as I remembered, the familiar smell of wood, the slight scent of dinner, still lingering in the air, yet nothing felt the same. The house felt almost foreign now, like a place I no longer understood. My mother appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw me. She didn't say anything at first. She just reached for me and pulled me into a hug. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. She pulled back, her eyes brimming with tears. "You don't need to apologize, Emma. We're just happy you're here." We sat down together, in the living room. The silence was strange, but not uncomfortable. It was like we were both trying to find our way back to each other. It wasn't easy, but we were trying. After a while, my father spoke up, his voice steady. "We've been thinking about what happened, about how we pushed you. We didn't give you the space you needed, and we're sorry for that." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I hadn't expected them to understand so quickly, but there it was, an apology, even if unspoken. "I've been scared too," I admitted quietly, scared of not knowing what I'm supposed to do, who I'm supposed to be, scared of growing up. My mother's expression softened. "It's okay to be scared. We all are, but we just want you to know that you don't have to have everything. Figured out right now. You're allowed to take your time." The words settled in me like a quiet relief. It was the first time in a long while I didn't feel so much pressure to get everything right immediately. Growing up didn't have to mean being perfect or having every step of my life planned out. It was about learning to navigate it one moment at a time, even if it was messy. "I don't know what the future holds," I said, looking at them both, "but I think I'm ready to try. I don't want to run away from growing up anymore." My father smiled softly. "You don't have to have all the answers now. Just take it one step at a time. We'll be here." As I sat there, a sense of calm washed over me. I didn't need to have it all figured out yet. Maybe growing up wasn't about achieving some ideal. Maybe it was about accepting that I was still becoming who I was meant to be, and that was enough. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that the fear I'd felt about growing up wasn't as overwhelming as I had imagined. I wasn't losing myself. I was simply changing, and that was okay. The days following my return home passed in a blur. The house felt different now, not in the way that something has changed, but in the way you grow into a pair of shoes that used to pinch. It was as though I could see things more clearly, with a distance that allowed me to appreciate what I had once taken for granted. The conversation with my parents had been a turning point. They no longer seemed so distant, so judgmental, but more like people who were navigating their own fears and insecurities. They had let go of their expectations and were learning to accept me as I was, not as they had hoped I would be. But in return, I had to let go of the anger I'd been carrying. Anger at them, at myself, at the world for putting so much pressure on me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. But life wasn't as simple as just returning home. It wasn't a magical reset. I knew I couldn't just settle back into my old life. The questions still hovered in the air, unanswered, and the uncertainty loomed larger than ever. But there was something different about this uncertainty. It didn't feel like a void I had to fill immediately. It was a space to grow, to explore, to learn. A few weeks after I returned, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the street outside. I had to admit, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do next. I had toyed with the idea of going back to school, picking up where I left off, but that didn't feel like the answer. It felt more like a placeholder, a way to distract myself from the bigger question. Who was I really? That was the question that kept me up at night, gnawing at me with a quiet persistence. Who was I meant to be? What did it mean to grow up? I had spent so much time trying to escape adulthood, trying to avoid the responsibilities that came with it, that I hadn't realized I was missing the point. Growing up wasn't about checking off boxes or following some predetermined path. It was about figuring out who I was, even if that process took time, and being okay with not knowing the answers immediately. One evening, after dinner, I sat down with my parents again. This time, the conversation felt less like a confrontation and more like a shared understanding. "I think I'm ready to take the next step," I said, my voice steady. "I don't know exactly what that step is yet, but I know I can't stay in this limbo forever." My mother smiled softly, her eyes brimming with pride. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Emma. You just have to keep moving forward, even if it's one small step at a time." I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of relief. I was still scared, still unsure, but I wasn't frozen anymore. I was ready to move, to start building something that was entirely my own. Over the next few months, I found myself exploring new paths, taking up an old hobby, diving into freelance work, and connecting with people who shared my interests. I didn't have a plan in the traditional sense, but I was discovering who I could be, without the heavy weight of expectations on my shoulders. The journey wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, moments where I wanted to give up and go back to the way things were. But each time I remembered what my parents had said. Growing up wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about learning to live with the uncertainty and finding peace within it. I wasn't quite the person I was supposed to be yet, but for the first time, I felt okay with that. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was just the next chapter of my story. And for once, I was ready to embrace it. The world outside had changed. Spring had settled in, turning the streets into a mosaic of green, yellow, and violet. I was out of the house more often than not, running errands or meeting new people, trying my hand at freelance projects I never thought I could do. It felt strange, both liberating and terrifying, this new version of myself. But something inside me had shifted, and that shift made the world seem a little more open. My parents still checked in on me, their concern unspoken but palpable. They weren't pushing anymore, but there were moments when I could feel them, watching me carefully, almost as if waiting for me to falter. I didn't blame them. The weight of the lost years, the time I had spent drifting, had left us all with unspoken words and quiet worries. But I was different now, and somehow I could feel them beginning to realize that. One afternoon, after a busy morning filled with phone calls and emails, I found myself sitting in the park. It was the same park I used to visit when I was younger, back when things felt simpler. The sun was warm, and I let the rays wash over me, closing my eyes for a moment, letting myself breathe in the air that smelled of grass and blooming flowers. I realized that I didn't have to have it all figured out. It was easy to get caught, up in the rush of expectations, to constantly feel like I was falling short. But now, sitting in the park, I realized that it was okay to take things one day at a time. The pressure had always been self-imposed, a product of my own fear and doubt. What mattered now was that I was moving forward. Later that evening, I sat down to call my parents. It wasn't the usual check-in conversation. There were no questions about what I was doing or what I planned to do next. Instead, we talked. We shared stories, laughed at silly things, and talked about my freelance projects. It felt so natural, so effortless. There were no walls between us anymore, no expectations weighing me down. It was just us, sharing a quiet moment together. After we hung up, I sat back and thought about the journey I had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there were still a lot of unknowns, but I had found my way. I wasn't in the same place I had been when I first left. The uncertainty was still there, but it no longer held the same power over me. I had learned to move through it, to keep going even when I couldn't see what lay ahead. The next morning, I decided to make another change. I booked a ticket to a city I had always wanted to visit, a place where I could explore new opportunities and meet new people. It wasn't about running away. It was about taking a step forward, a step that would allow me to grow, to discover more of who I was and what I wanted. As I packed my bag, I thought about the book my parents had given me. It had been a catalyst, a wake-up call, but in the end, it was more than just a message from them. It had been a reminder to take ownership of my life, to stop waiting for things to fall into place. I had to make things happen. I had to step into the unknown with courage, even when it felt overwhelming. I was ready. The future was still full of uncertainty, but it was also full of possibilities. And for the first time, I was excited to see where it would take me. The city was nothing like I'd imagined. It was bigger, louder, and more alive than I had anticipated. I arrived early in the morning, the sun just beginning to climb over the skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. The air smelled of fresh coffee, street food, and the sharp tang of the urban environment. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the next chapter. I had no plan, no idea where I'd stay, or how long I'd be in the city, but somehow, that felt right. It was exactly the kind of uncertainty I had been craving. Back home, I had always been wrapped in layers of predictability. My parents had taken care of the details, they had mapped out my future in ways I couldn't escape. Here, though, I was alone with my choices. My decisions would determine what came next. I wandered the streets for hours, just taking everything in. The crowd was diverse, the architecture stark and modern, with hints of history woven between the buildings. It felt like a city of possibility, a place where anything could happen. I was both overwhelmed and energized by it. By midday, I found a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a different time. Small, cozy, with mismatched chairs and soft music playing in the background. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching people go by, each one living a life of their own. It was strange, in a way, to realize that the world didn't stop just because I was making changes. The world kept turning, regardless of whether I had figured things out yet. But that was okay. I spent the next few days getting acquainted with the city, visiting local markets, meeting people who seemed to understand my need for something new, something different. There was a freedom here I couldn't have found at home, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly myself. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the promise of whatever I wanted to make of this place. On my 30th day, I found a small flat to rent. It wasn't much, just a one-room space with a kitchenette and a small bed by the window, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the floor creaked in certain spots, but it felt like a starting point. It felt like the right place to begin again. That evening, as I unpacked my things, I took a moment to reflect. There was so much I had left behind. So many memories, so much uncertainty, but there was also so much ahead of me. This city was a blank slate, and I was ready to fill it with new experiences. I was determined not to repeat the same patterns, to not slip into old habits of waiting for someone else to give me direction. I had to be my own guide now. It was then that I realized just how far I had come. The girl who had left home in a huff, angry and lost, was gone. I had grown in ways I never imagined. Yes, the road had been difficult, but each challenge had shaped me, made me stronger, more capable. I was still learning, still figuring things out. But for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. I called my parents later that evening, and for the first time, our conversation didn't feel forced. They didn't ask if I was okay, or what I was doing. Instead, we just talked. We talked about the changes in my life, the small victories, and the quiet moments of contentment. It was a conversation of equals, not parent and child, but two people trying to navigate their own lives. They were proud of me in their own way, and I realized for the first time that I was proud of myself too. The longer I stayed in the city, the more I began to feel like I was building something of my own. I had a routine now, a rhythm to my days that kept me grounded. I worked odd jobs here and there, some of them tedious, others more interesting, but none of them particularly important. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was surviving, and that was something I never thought I would be able to do on my own. But just as everything was beginning to settle, I received an unexpected call. It was my mother. Her voice on the other end of the line was shaky, tight with emotion. I could tell right away something was wrong. "Emma," she said, her tone soft but urgent. "We need to talk." I felt the air shift in the room, the way it always did when I knew something serious was coming. A wave of unease washed over me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt myself falter. My mother had always been my emotional anchor. Her voice had been a constant, familiar presence. But now, it felt as if a distance had grown between us, one I didn't know how to bridge. I agreed to meet her. She was coming into the city the next day, and we would talk then. The thought of facing her, seeing her after all this time, felt surreal. I had grown accustomed to being on my own, to carving out a space that was just mine. The idea of reconnecting with the people I had left behind was both comforting and terrifying. When I saw her the next day, it wasn't like I expected. She wasn't angry as I'd feared, nor was she full of the judgment I'd anticipated. She was tired. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a weight for far too long. She looked older, somehow more fragile than I remembered. We met at a small cafe. the same place I had gone to when I first arrived. It felt fitting. Our conversation would begin here, where everything had changed for me. As she sat down across from me, she took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Emma," she started, her voice softer now. "We didn't know. We didn't understand what you needed. We thought you were just being rebellious, that you were lost. But I realize now that we failed you in a way. We didn't give you the space to grow on your own. I hadn't expected this." My mother admitting fault. It was a strange thing to hear, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. But the more she spoke, the more I understood. She wasn't just apologizing, she was giving me permission. Permission to be who I had become. Permission to continue down the path I had chosen. I could feel the walls between us beginning to crumble, slowly but steadily. My anger, my frustration from all those months, years even, melted away as she spoke. It wasn't about what had happened before anymore. It was about the present, about us trying to find a way back to each other, despite everything that had come before. "I've been thinking about that book we gave you," she continued, almost hesitantly. "I know it wasn't the right thing, not the way we gave it to you, but maybe we weren't wrong about what you needed. Maybe you do need to grow up. We all do. But that doesn't mean we can't still grow together." Her words hit harder than I expected. I had always seen the book as the catalyst for my escape, the moment they'd pushed me out of their world. But now, in this moment of raw honesty, I realized that it wasn't just a symbol of their expectations, it was their way of trying to guide me, even if they hadn't done it in the best way. It was, in its own flawed way, an act of love. I took a deep breath. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear it back then, but I am now. I think I've grown, but not just in the way you thought. I'm not just adulting, as people say. I'm learning who I am in ways I never had the chance to before. She nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I think I'm starting to understand that, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to be angry at them for not understanding. I felt at peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a resolution to everything, but it was a step forward. And sometimes, that was enough. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the conversation. There were still so many things left unsaid, so many years of miscommunication and unmet expectations. But for now, we had made progress, and that was enough. It was strange sitting across from my mother after all this time. The tension that had been a constant presence in my life, the feeling of having to hold everything together and act like it was all fine, was slowly beginning to slip away. Me realized that, despite everything I'd built on my own, there was still a part of me that craved connection, craved the comfort of family, even if I wasn't sure where I fit in it anymore. But my mind kept drifting back to the idea of growing up. What did it really mean? For so long, I had thought of it as something to resist, something that would change me into someone I didn't want to be. But now, sitting here with my mother, I saw it differently. Growing up didn't have to mean losing myself. It didn't have to mean becoming someone else entirely. It could just be about finding the balance between who I had been and who I was, still becoming. As we parted ways, my mother gave me a small, hesitant smile. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden magical shift in our relationship, but there was something better, understanding, and that was a good enough start. In the days that followed, something shifted within me. I started looking at my life differently, through a lens that wasn't clouded by resentment or anger. There was a certain freedom that came with it. A lightness in the way I moved through the world. I no longer felt as if I were running away from something. I felt like I was simply moving forward, creating a life that was uniquely mine. I kept in touch with my parents, but I also began to carve out a space where I could live without needing constant validation from them. It wasn't about rejecting them or their love, but about finally learning to trust myself. For the first time, I realized that I didn't have to be afraid of change. I didn't have to fear growing up. In fact, it was one of the most liberating experiences of my life. And then, one evening, as I was walking home from a late shift at the cafe, I stopped in front of a small bookstore. It was the same bookstore I had passed countless times, never giving it more than a passing glance. But tonight, something was different. I found myself drawn to it, almost as if it were calling to me. I pushed open the door and walked inside. The familiar scent of old paper and dust filled the air, and for a moment, it felt like I had returned home. The shelves were lined with books that seemed to whisper stories of the past, of lives lived and lost, of journeys taken and forgotten. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of the words contained within. And then, at the very back of the store, I saw it, the book I had once discarded, the one that had sent me fleeing in the first place. How to Grow Up. It was sitting there on a shelf, forgotten, gathering dust. I hadn't thought about it in weeks. But now, in this moment, it felt like the right time. With a deep breath, I reached for it. The decision to buy it wasn't a monumental one. It wasn't about needing answers or about finding closure. It was about recognizing that I was no longer the person I had been when I first read it. I was someone new, someone who had grown, who was still growing. I wasn't afraid of the lessons it might offer now. In fact, I was eager to see what I might discover within its pages. I paid for the book, my fingers lingering on the worn cover for just a moment longer than necessary, before I tucked it under my arm and stepped back, out into the night. The city around me was the same, but I felt different, more grounded, more aware of who I was and what I was capable of. As I walked home, I thought about how much had changed since I first left, how much I had changed. There was still so much I didn't understand about life, about growing up, but for the first time I felt ready to face it, to embrace whatever came next. I was finally starting to understand that growing up wasn't about having all the answers or about following some prescribed path. It was about becoming who you were meant to be, step by step. It was about making mistakes, learning from them, and learning to love yourself along the way. And as I reached my door and stepped inside, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. The weeks that followed felt like a blur, a mix of moments where I was more present in my life than I had ever been, and others when I felt completely disconnected from everything that had come before. There was a sense of freedom in the unknown, but also a strange ache in the places I had left behind, places I had tried so hard to escape. I still kept the book, How to Grow Up. It sat beside my bed, its pages yellowed with time. I hadn't read it again, not yet. There was no need. The journey I had embarked on was no longer about the pages of that book or the advice it offered. It had been about what I had found within myself, what I had learned in the silence between the words. But there was something else that had changed too. My relationship with my parents. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but we had begun speaking to each other again. And for the first time in years, we were doing so without expectations, without any preconceived notions of what it should be. We were just talking. When I visited them one weekend, I brought up the book. My mother had asked if I'd read it again yet, and I told her I hadn't. Instead, I shared what I had learned, not from the book, but from the time I had spent away from them, away from everything I thought I knew about myself. I told her that I understood now that they had been trying to push me in a direction, but they hadn't understood that the only person who could truly guide me was me. She didn't say much at first, just nodded slowly, and I could see the weight of the years lifting slightly from her shoulders. My father, quiet as always, seemed to consider it before speaking. "I never wanted to push you away," he said simply. "I just wanted you to stop feeling like you were lost. But maybe we were both lost." And in that moment, I realized something else. Growing up wasn't just about me finding my own way. It was about understanding the paths others had taken too. understanding that they were just as human as I was. They had their own struggles, their own ways of navigating the world, and perhaps they had been as uncertain about me as I had been about them. That weekend marked a turning point. It wasn't a grand resolution, not a sudden change in how we interacted or how we saw each other. But it was a start, a beginning. We still had our differences, but we were learning to meet each other where we were without expectations. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the city I had left behind, to the life I had built from scratch. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I had finally accepted that I didn't need to know. I had spent so much time trying to figure it out, trying to control the direction I was heading in. But I was beginning to understand that life wasn't a puzzle to solve. It was a journey to experience. And so, I kept walking forward. Each step felt lighter, easier. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But I had found peace in the uncertainty, in knowing that it was okay not to know, that the process of growing up wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace, step by step, day by day. When I finally picked up the book again, I didn't open it to search for answers. I opened it because, in the end, it had been a symbol of everything I had needed to let go of in order to grow. I wasn't that person anymore. The one who had run away, the one who had been afraid of change. I was someone new, someone still becoming, and that was enough. I closed the book once more, this time with a sense of completion, a sense of peace. The final step had been taken. It wasn't about the book, or about my parents, or about the life I had left behind. It was about me finally understanding who I was and who I was still becoming. And in that moment, I felt for the first time that I was exactly where I was supposed to be.